I never thought I'd find myself telling this story, but maybe there's something for others to learn from it. So here goes. My name is Victoria, and for as long as I can remember, I've always valued loyalty, honesty, and respect in relationships. But as they say, life sometimes takes unexpected turns, and mine certainly did one sunny afternoon. It all began innocently enough, as these things usually do. My nephew, Alex, was spending the summer with me while his parents traveled. He's a smart kid, witty, and always a bit of a curious one, constantly looking to explore, which I'd usually encourage. However, that curiosity set in motion something none of us expected. My story truly began when I met Richard a few years ago. He wasn't family, but he had become a close friend, someone I'd come to rely on for laughter, support, and endless conversation. Richard and I shared a unique bond, unlike any I'd ever experienced. You see, we both had this unspoken understanding that felt deeper than words. Over time, this connection grew, even though we both maintained boundaries. He knew I was married, and he never tried to cross that line. Or at least, that's what I believed. On that particular day, my nephew Alex had gone to spend time with his friends, and I found myself alone in the house. I thought it would be the perfect time to catch up with Richard over the phone. Our calls had become a sort of routine, a chance to laugh and share things we couldn't with anyone else. Little did I know, this one conversation would change everything. I remember every detail about that phone call. Richard's voice was warm, familiar, and oddly comforting. As we chatted, the conversation began drifting into deeper waters. We talked about our dreams, about the challenges we faced, and even the parts of life that felt empty. He told me about the struggles he was having with his own relationship, and how disconnected he'd felt. In some strange way, I understood, but I kept reminding myself that I was there as a friend, nothing more. And yet, as our conversation continued, something shifted. I began to feel a strange pull towards him, a sense of longing that I couldn't shake. It was confusing, and as much as I tried to ignore it, that feeling lingered. It's funny how quickly things can go from simple to complicated. Just as our conversation was growing more personal, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch. I froze, my heart pounding. I quickly ended the call, trying to shake off the strange mix of emotions swirling inside me. Turning toward the door, I saw Alex standing there, his eyes wide as if he'd caught me doing something wrong. I tried to brush it off, asked him how his day was, and carried on with the usual small talk. But something felt different. As we talked, he looked at me with this strange curiosity. I don't know what he'd overheard, but I had this nagging feeling that he sensed something was off. His eyes lingered on mine, as if he were trying to piece together something he didn't quite understand. As the day wore on, I couldn't shake the tension that had built up. Later that evening, as I prepared dinner, Richard's voice echoed in my mind. Our conversation kept replaying, and I found myself wondering if I was making a mistake by letting these feelings go unaddressed. I felt guilty, but at the same time, I couldn't deny the connection we had. I knew one thing. I couldn't go on like this without making a decision. Either I needed to cut ties with Richard, or confront these feelings head-on before they risked breaking apart everything I'd worked so hard to build. Little did I know, that was just the beginning of a series of events that would bring everything to the surface in ways I couldn't imagine. After that unsettling encounter with Alex, I couldn't sleep. The guilt, the confusion, it all weighed on me like never before. I tossed and turned, wondering what he might have overheard and how much he understood. But more than anything, I couldn't stop thinking about Richard. The memory of our conversation, the warmth in his voice, lingered in my mind, and that in itself made me feel uneasy. This was a friendship that had turned into something far more complex, and I was afraid to admit how close I'd come to stepping over the line. A few days later, Richard called again. I hesitated for a moment, knowing that picking up would only lead me down that confusing path once more. But curiosity got the best of me, and I answered. He was just as charming and kind as ever, asking about my day, sharing a few funny stories, and listening intently to everything I said. It felt good to talk to him. It always did, As we talked, I noticed Alex lingering in the hallway, glancing over at me with that same curious look. I quickly ended the call and, trying to be nonchalant, I asked Alex if he needed something. He hesitated, then came into the room and sat down across from me, his expression serious. "Aunt Victoria," he began, "I've been meaning to ask you, who's Richard?" My heart stopped. I knew kids could be perceptive, but I hadn't realized how much he'd picked up on. Trying to play it cool, I explained that Richard was just a friend, someone I'd known for a long time. But Alex wasn't convinced. He looked at me with an almost adult-like intensity and said, "It doesn't seem like you're just friends." That hit me hard. The last thing I wanted was for my nephew to see me in a negative light, especially when I hadn't actually done anything wrong. Or had I? Emotional attachment can be just as powerful as any physical connection, and at that moment, I felt the weight of it. Over the next few days, I wrestled with my feelings. I knew I needed to come to terms with whatever was happening between Richard and me, or else it would haunt me. In a rare moment of courage, I called Richard and asked if we could meet in person. It was time for an honest conversation, one that I'd been avoiding for too long. We met at a small cafe on the edge of town, somewhere we'd never run into anyone we knew. As soon as I saw him, I felt my heart race, and I hated myself for it. I was embarrassed and conflicted, unsure of how to even begin. But as soon as we sat down, Richard looked at me with that familiar kindness, and all my apprehensions melted away. "Victoria," he said softly, "I think we both know there's something more going on here than we'd like to admit." I nodded, unable to meet his gaze. He continued, "We're close, and I'll admit that I care about you deeply. But this isn't fair to either of us or the people in our lives." For a moment, we sat in silence, both lost in our own thoughts. He was right. We'd both allowed ourselves to drift into something that felt exciting, but ultimately couldn't lead anywhere good. And as painful as it was, I knew we had to let go. We spent a few more moments sharing a quiet understanding that didn't need words. Saying goodbye to Richard felt like losing a piece of myself, but I also felt an unexpected sense of relief. I knew I'd made the right choice, one that would allow me to move forward with integrity. As I drove home that evening, I felt lighter, though still a bit shaken. I knew I had things to work through, but I also knew I had just saved myself from crossing a line I'd never forgive myself for. When I walked through the door, Alex was there, waiting for me. He looked at me with a sense of relief, as though he'd sensed the weight had been lifted. In that moment, I realized how much my actions had affected him, even if he didn't fully understand what was going on. I sat down beside him, and without saying a word, he gave me a small nod as if to say he understood. It was a silent reassurance that I'd made the right decision. This experience taught me that even the closest friendships can blur into dangerous territory if we're not careful. But I also learned the importance of drawing those lines and staying true to the values I hold dear.